Hi everyone, so we're going to cover chapter 7 on cognitive and social cognitive aspects of personality. The beginning of cognitive psychology started with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. So with this theory, people began to focus more on the human mind seen in biological terms. And so it expanded the thinking about human nature that cognitive psychology could begin in earnest. So scientists could begin to explore how thinking changed as a child developed and how a child was influenced by different circumstances and was shaped by culture. Gestalt psychology was an intellectual movement that became very influential in Germany in the 1920s, and it was brought to America in the 1930s. The German word Gestalt means pattern or configuration. And this view is that the configuration of a complex stimulus is its essence. And so the central components of this theory are that human beings seek meaning in their environments. We construct what we see. We organize the sensations we receive from the world around us into meaningful perceptions. Complex stimuli are not reducible to the sums of their parts. And so when we see objects around us, we are constructing meaning behind the objects. So for example, when we are observing a triangle, we are not just looking at the three straight lines of a triangle. The same way that we are looking at a triangular relationship among friends, we are not just looking at three separate relationships, but rather we see things as a whole because we are constructing the stimuli to make sense. Kurt Lewin came up with the field theory, which suggests that you are a combination of everything you've ever known. So this theory assumes that human behavior is resulting from the interplay between the individual and their environment. And so the theory provides a breakdown of what life space is and what forces are. So at the core of the field theory is life space. And this represents all the factors influencing a person's behavior at any moment. So it includes people's past experiences, their current perceptions, goals, and other external environmental factors. Then there's a notion of field. So within the life space, there are various forces that are at play. And some forces push the individual towards a particular behavior, while others might pull them away. So all of the internal and external forces are acting on an individual. And these forces could be desires or fears, which would be internal examples, and then external could be peer pressure or societal norms. And so focus is about the structural relationships between the person and their environment. All individuals have distinctive cognitive styles of dealing with their everyday tasks of perception, problem solving, and decision making. People differ on many dimensions, and this could explain why some people are more simple in terms of seeing the world on simpler terms, and why some people may see the world in more complex, sophisticated terms. One cognitive style variable is known as field dependence. So people that are highly field dependent are very influenced in their problem solving by aspects of the context. And so they pay attention to things in the environment that are highly noticeable, but they are not directly relevant to the solution. Field independence style is more analytical and allows for more complex levels of restructuring in problem solving. So people that are highly field independent are not as influenced by contextual factors. So the cognitive approach to personality examines the mechanisms of expecting, attending, and information processing. So it really focuses on how we construct the world around us. Piaget's contributions focused on intellectual development. So he was interested in looking at how children developed concepts about the world around them, and he proposed a cognitive structural explanation. Piaget's schema theory describes the concept of schemas. So this theory argues that as children grow and develop, they are building schemas, patterns of thinking and behavior that are acquired over time and that are used to interpret the world. So schemas is a cognitive framework that helps us organize and interpret information. And new schemas are built on existing ones. They are built on the schemas acquired earlier. And so when new information from the world comes in, we modify our existing schema in order to fit that information. So for example, children may see a dog that has 4 legs. Then they see a horse. Then they see a cat. And so over time, children learn to classify different animals, depending on whether they have 4 legs or 2 legs. And this is what we're constantly doing. And so we're constantly modifying our existing schemas. And we have different kinds of schemas. We have personal schemas that describe ourselves. If somebody were to ask what our personality traits are or what we look like, we already know in our head all of the different classifications that we assign to ourselves. We have self schemas, event schemas, and social schemas. Social schemas are describing the social etiquette that we acquire over time, over being in different situations, over learning what is expected of us in that given situation, how we need to behave. And so you're constantly acquiring new information and you're putting it into a database. And this database is organizing all of the information and structuring it in a way that you understand it. A schema that is activated in a given situation is a major determinant of our expectations, inferences, and actions in that situation. So we have schemas that exist at many levels and schemas at different levels that can simultaneously be active in influencing our behavior. We all categorize events, objects, and people that we encounter. So categorization occurs automatically without our effort or conscious intention. And so in many situations, people normally begin consideration of an object by assigning it to a category. And we do this by creating schemas. And so when we create schemas in our head, we're categorizing information. Once a category exists for us, when we encounter something new that matches a few features of that category, we fill in the blanks with the rest of the information that applies to that category. So when we approach new situations, it really depends on a combination of stereotypes, social categories, higher level thought processes, and the immediate low level processing of facial, vocal, and bodily cues. So we're taking in new information and we're trying to fit it in a category where its key features are the most similar to that category. Now, with attention, people vary in their attention to things, which is a source of stable individual differences. And so what we pick up on and what we're absorbing and categorizing depends on the person and what they're paying attention to. And because there's so much information in the world, we are constantly filtering out noise. we cannot possibly pay attention to every single thing that's going on around us. So people tend to pick up a few key features of their current environment, and they filter these in light of their current goals and feelings at the time. So we cannot possibly pay attention to all the things around us all at once. And so we've tried to filter out the noise and pick a few things that we think are important that will match a particular category. One way in which individuals differ is in the extent to which their attention is under their intentional control. People who are diagnosed as having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder have atypical attentional processes. And so attentional behavior in these individuals differs in many different ways from that of most people. Their symptoms appear to be associated with the inability to appropriately shift their attention from one spatial location to another. Many researchers argue that people who have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder tend to go untreated, or they may even go undiagnosed because they don't have the hyperactivity component. But there are several subtypes of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So one is the hyperactive impulsive type. Then there's inattentive type without the hyperactivity impulsivity. Or they have the combined type, in which they have both inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity. People with attention deficit disorder are often capable of very intense concentration, also known as hyperattention, which means they are very focused on a task and very engaged in it with this deep, long-lasting concentration compared to other people. And they're so deeply focused on it that they can sometimes have difficulty disengaging from that task or activity. Cognitive influences on interpersonal relationships can shape personality. These cognitive influences depend on how we perceive ourselves, how we are perceiving others, how we are categorizing our relationships, and the goals that we have for the relationships. So, for example, take rejection sensitivity. This is a personality variable, and this captures the extent to which a person is overly sensitive to cues that they are being rejected by another person. And so over time, because of these negative experiences that they may have had, maybe being rejected by a parent or a friend or a peer, it carries over into other relationships because they start to then develop this expectation of rejection. And so this hypersensitivity to cues of rejection in interpreting behaviors of other people causes the person to behave and act in ways that lead to a greater likelihood of actual rejection. And so this is how our cognitive influences have an effect on our interpersonal relationships, which then in turn have an effect on our experience. And then that experience is what is taken as new information, and it feeds back into our cognitive representation or our database of all of our experiences. George Kelly's personal construct theory focuses on people's active endeavors to construct the world. So this approach is called constructivism because people are constructing their own versions of reality. So people are like many scientists that form their own theories. And so we form our own theories and then use our personal experiences as the data that support the theory. So each of us always tries to figure out how our worlds work and try to understand it in different ways. And so this is the thrust of George Kelly's influential perspective on personality, because each of us are trying to understand the world, and we do so by forming theories and then testing our hypotheses to see if our theory holds true. And so over time, as we get new information and form new experiences, we change as we reorganize our construct systems. Kelly devised a unique assessment called the Role Construct Repertory Test, and it's designed to evoke a personal construct system. Rather than asking people to rate or rank a set of traits or dimensions of personality that the test creator thinks are important, the goal of this instrument is to allow the person's own understanding of personality to emerge through the process of making comparisons. Social intelligence is defined as the ability to understand and influence other people. So people vary in this ability, and social intelligence captures the ways in which individuals differ from one another in their interpersonal skills. So measuring social intelligence is measuring the extent to which we are able to develop knowledge and skills relevant to interpersonal situations. Emotional intelligence is having specific emotional abilities to deal with other people. So emotional intelligence has 5 components, and you're able to measure emotional intelligence based on these 5. So it's being self-aware, controlling your anger and anxiety, being persistent and optimistic in the face of setbacks, being empathetic, and interacting smoothly with others. Explanatory style refers to a set of cognitive personality variables that capture habitual means of interpreting events in your life. So there's a variety of approaches to the central idea of explanatory style. Optimism and pessimism are the extreme poles of explanatory style. People with an optimistic style tend to interpret events in their lives with an optimistic perspective. They perceive neutral events as positive, and they see the potential in negative events. They also tend to have a higher level of perceived control over a situation, whereas a pessimistic style, they tend to focus on the negative potentials of a situation, and they typically anticipate poorer outcomes. So for example, if a student that has an optimistic explanatory style receives a poor grade on an exam, they may consider that to be useful feedback, and they may change their study habits or believe if they take better notes, they'll get a better grade. And so they're less likely to attribute the bad grade to their lack of ability or their personality. Whereas with a pessimistic style, if a person gets a poor grade, they're more likely to blame factors that are out of their control. They may view the poor grade as a sign of their own lack of ability. And so this is more of a stable attribution to an internal cause. And so their expectations for their future performance would be lower. And so these are the differences between pessimistic styles and optimistic styles. 2 other concepts are learned helplessness and learned optimism. Learned helplessness results from repeated exposure to unavoidable punishment. So the repeated exposure leads an organism to later accept punishment even when it is avoidable. So there was a series of experiments done on dogs where unpleasant electric shocks were administered repeatedly to dogs who could not escape. But when the restraints were removed, the dogs could easily have avoided continued shocks, but yet they tended to stay in the same place and suffer further punishment. So, in other words, they had learned that they were helpless to control the punishment, and so they gave up trying to escape or avoid it. And other experiments people show the same result. So once an individual learns that they are not in control, the motivation to seek control may be shut down, even when control later becomes possible. So learned optimism is achieved by training people to think differently about themselves. And this helps people develop healthier responses that characterize people who have an optimistic style. So fortunately, there is research showing that teaching children to challenge their pessimistic thoughts can help them fight depression later on in adulthood. And so this is like a cognitive intervention that teaches people to change their thought processes, and that can affect subsequent behaviors later on. Julian Roeder was a social learning theorist and was an important bridge between the traditional social learning theories and the most modern ideas that have come to be called social cognitive theory. And according to Roeder, our behavior depends both on how strongly we expect that our performance will have a positive result and how much we value that expected reinforcement. So the expectation that our performance will have a positive result is called outcome expectancy, and how much we value that expected reinforcement is known as reinforcement value. So his theory focuses on why an individual performs a behavior and which behavior they actually perform in a specific situation. Roeder also proposed specific expectancies and generalized expectancies as situational concepts that describe why a person's behavior might change in different situations. So in any environment, people have a variety of responses and behaviors. And some of these behaviors are more likely to occur in specific situations than others. And this is called behavior potential. So in some situations, a person may laugh or be sociable, but in other situations, they may be very quiet and reserved. And so there are specific expectancies that a particular reward will follow a behavior in a particular situation, and general expectancies that are related to a group of situations. So, for example, a person might have the generalized expectation of enjoying parties, but the additional specific expectancy of not enjoying an office holiday party. And so, in specific situations, people may desire something completely different from their general norm or from their generalized expectancy. Roeder describes 6 psychological needs that develop out of biological needs. Status, which is the need to achieve something and be seen as competent. Dominance, which is the need to have power and influence. Independence, which is the need for autonomy. Protection dependency, which is the need to have others give us security. Love and affection, which is a need to be liked and cared for by others. And physical comfort, which is the need to avoid pain, seek pleasure, enjoy physical security, and a sense of well-being. Behavior potential, outcome expectancy, and reinforcement potential all come together to form the term psychological situation. And so the power of the situation in behavior is frequently downplayed. So the psychological situation represents the individual's unique combination of potential behaviors and their value to him or her. A person's expectations and values interact with situational constraints to exert a powerful influence on behavior. Roeder also stressed the concept of locus of control, also known as external versus internal control of reinforcement. So this is the idea that we make certain attributions based on outcomes that happen. And so when a situation occurs, the locus of control that we use is the attributions that we make to the cause of that outcome. And so we attribute certain causes to our behavior or situations. So when someone has an internal locus of control, they are likely to believe that their own actions are what caused the outcome. And so it's this generalized expectancy that an individual's own actions will lead to a desired outcome. An external locus of control is focused on things outside of the individual that may have caused the behavior or the situation. And so somebody with an external locus of control is likely to believe that an outcome occurred due to chance or powerful others, but it did not occur due to their own actions. Roeder developed a scale of internal and external locus of control, which measures an individual's beliefs about the determinants of his or her behavior. So these dimensions of locus of control are internality, luck or chance, and powerful others. Albert Bandura was another social cognitive theorist whose work focused on addressing the nature of observational learning. And he was inspired by Clark Hull and Edward Tolman. And he gives an important role in personality to what he calls the self system, which is a set of cognitive processes by which a person perceives, evaluates, and regulates their own behavior so that it's appropriate to the environment. So as I said earlier, the self system is a set of cognitive mechanisms by which a person perceives and regulates their own behavior so that it's appropriate to the environment. They are also regulating their behavior so that it is effective in achieving their goals. And so over time, people learn ways to respond appropriately in the environment that will get them a desired outcome. And the factors that are affecting their responses are their expectations, anticipated reinforcement, thoughts, plans, and goals. So all of these are being internalized, and they become internal processes of the self. And so all of these factors are really important during learning and become critical because the individual over time anticipates the possible consequences of their own actions. And they choose an action based on the anticipated response of the environment they're in and others in the environment. So this differs from classical behaviorist learning theories because the classical theory assumes that people's behavior changes over time in reaction to direct reinforcement. So people change their behavior based on reinforcement and punishment. But in Bandura's theory, people's behavior is changing not only from reinforcement, but because of changes in the person's knowledge and expectations. So the effects of prior reinforcement are being internalized, and this is why people change their behavior, not because of the direct effects, but because the effects of reinforcement get internalized, and then the person learns to anticipate the consequences of that behavior. And so over time, knowledge is gained due to prior experience. So observational learning is another type of learning, and it's learning through modeled behavior. And so you can imitate somebody's behavior and learn it without being directly rewarded or punished for the behavior. And so people who learn through observational learning, they can learn without performing the behavior themselves. And they are learning it through a model. And so attributes and characteristics of the model can influence the learning of the observer, and vice versa. Attributes of the observer can influence the learning of the observer. And so an observer's ability to imitate a model is limited by their cognitive and physical development. And successful modeling requires the ability to correctly perceive, encode, and reproduce that behavior. So age, gender, similarity to the observer, status, and competence, these are attributes of the model that can definitely influence the success of the learning. Self-efficacy is another concept referred to an expectancy about how competently one will be able to enact a behavior in a particular situation. This is different from the locus of control concept, because locus of control is really about whether you believe your own actions versus other people's actions or external events will lead to a desired outcome. This is more about whether you have the perceived capacity to achieve a behavior in a given situation. So it's really about your perceived competence level. So self-efficacy is this expectancy about how one competently is able to enact a behavior. And there's 4 types of information that determine self-efficacy. Our experiences trying to perform the target behavior or similar behavior, watching others perform that or similar behaviors, verbal persuasion, and how we feel about the behavior. So our emotional reactions to the behavior. So all of this information can determine how competent we feel in being able to enact that behavior. And this is really helpful for behavior change. So oftentimes with self-efficacy, in order to acquire behavior change or change past behavior or poor health habits, a lot of times self-efficacy skills are incorporated in order for somebody to successfully change their behavior. Self-regulation is the process by which people can control their own achievements and actions. So this process includes setting goals for themselves, evaluating their success at reaching those goals, and rewarding themselves for accomplishing the goals. Self-efficacy is really important in this process because it helps people influence their choice of goals and their expected levels of achievement for those goals. And so it's hard to have self-regulation without self-efficacy, because self-efficacy is the perceived competence that you have about achieving those goals and being able to change your behavior. And so if you have a high level of perceived competence and you feel like you are able to meet your goal, then you're more likely to have a plan set in place in order to achieve that goal. So self-regulation is really about the plan that you're going to implement for behavior change. And this is very relevant in health and education, as well as other applied areas where people want to change their behavior, but they don't know how. This is very relevant in health education, when people are trying to reduce their poor health habits, and they don't know how, or they feel motivated to, but they can't really get themselves to a place of setting a goal for themselves so that they can make progress towards changing their behavior. And so self-regulation and self-efficacy are both really crucial in behavior change. So psychologists are also evaluating the process of creating virtual personalities. And so because computers can manipulate information and they are information processors, they work similarly to our brains. And so there have been some attempts to apply computer simulation methods more broadly to personality. In such an approach, theoretical constructs are translated into a computer model, and the behavior of the model is examined under a variety of conditions. So by building a model, the model can learn relationships between different situations and the behaviors that are appropriate in those situations. And so it's possible to think that machines can also be programmed to have goals, beliefs, and mental states. And we are getting to a point now where computers can judge our personality without giving us personality tests. And they do this by tracking online behavior. So shopping history, likes on Facebook, or even buying something on a website, all of this data is tracking and analyzing our personality. And so all of our likes and dislikes and interests are being analyzed to produce a view of our personality that tends to be more accurate than personality tests. Overall, there are advantages and limitations of the cognitive approach to personality. One advantage is that it seeks to explain personality through the study of uniquely human processes of cognition. And it also captures the active nature of human thought. And so we're able to understand behavior based on people's thoughts, thought processes, perceptions, and attributions. The other advantage is that it helps us understand individuality. Differences in cognitive skills and abilities are viewed as central to understanding individual differences. The limitations are that it often ignores the unconscious and emotional aspects of personality. And because many cognitive studies are done through empirical experimentation, and the measures tend to be very objective, it tends to ignore unconscious theories. Other limitations are that it may underemphasize situational influences on behavior. And so the power of a situation can be underestimated according to cognitive theories. Another limitation is that some of these theories, similar to social learning theory, tend to oversimplify complex thought processes. And so there's more to it than internal versus external locus of control. There's more than modeling and learning behavior that somebody else does. And so we try to simplify it down based on these very simple concepts, but human thought is more complex than how we conceptualize it.